I walked into the garden, the scent of fresh-cut grass mingling with the bitter tang of impending rain. It was the kind of night where everything seemed draped in mystery, perfect for a masquerade, where everyone wore a mask, and the truth was as hidden as the faces behind them. The sprawling hedge maze was a labyrinth in itself, winding and twisting with no clear way out. The place had an almost eerie quality to it, like it was alive. But tonight, it wasn't the hedges or the night air that made it so unsettling. It was the body. A philanthropist named Edward Cranston lay sprawled across the cobbled path at the maze's center. He was dressed in a tuxedo, his mask still in place, though it didn't hide the death that had taken him. A decorative dagger, delicate, ornate, the kind you'd expect to see hanging on the wall of a lavish estate, was buried in his chest, its blade still gleaming with the faintest trace of crimson. I stepped closer, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound in the quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. The guests had scattered, most of them now standing at the edges of the maze, glancing nervously at one another. Some whispered in hushed tones, while others simply stared, their faces masked, their eyes wide with shock and fear. Detective Ethan Cole. I turned, not surprised to see my partner, Claire, walking toward me. She was sharp, too sharp at times, and had a way of cutting through the nonsense. If there was anyone who could keep me grounded right now, it was her. Who found him? I asked. A couple of guests. They were in the maze when they stumbled across the body. She glanced around, her eyes flicking to the others in the distance. None of them looked particularly shocked, though. A little too calm for a group of people who've just seen a man stabbed in the heart. I frowned, kneeling beside the body. Edward Cranston had been a prominent figure in the city, well known for his charitable works and high society connections. But there was more to this death than met the eye. I could feel it. The knife was too deliberate, too personal. Who are the guests? I asked. Claire pulled out a notebook, her pen ready. A mixed crowd, business tycoons, artists, politicians, a few socialites. Cranston's inner circle. They all had an invitation, but none of them seemed particularly distraught. They're not even moving to help. I stood up, scanning the maze, the dark paths veiled in shadows. Keep everyone here. No one leaves until I get their stories. The maze had a way of disorienting people, especially when the paths twisted back on themselves in confusing ways. Cranston's death wasn't random. Whoever killed him had likely known the layout of the maze, and had a reason for bringing him here, to this exact spot. Any signs of struggle? I asked, turning back to the body. None. He was stabbed from behind. No defensive wounds. And the dagger? Well, it's too clean, almost ceremonial. Claire said. That made sense. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime, and it wasn't something anyone had just grabbed in the heat of the moment. This murder had been planned. I walked slowly around the body, considering the possibilities. There were a dozen or more guests, each with a reason to want Cranston gone. His business dealings had caused more than a few rifts in the philanthropic world. He had the kind of influence that could make enemies faster than you could count. But what really got under my skin was the maze. Whoever did this had been able to move through it with ease. It was like they knew where to go, how to disappear. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Something didn't add up. I motioned for Claire to follow me as I stepped into the maze, my eyes darting to every turn, every hedge. The guests' movements seemed too carefully orchestrated, like they were all playing a part in some grand performance, their masks hiding more than just their faces. The dagger, the lack of struggle, the maze itself, it was all connected. Somewhere in this garden of deceit, the truth was waiting. I just had to find it. The maze twisted and turned before me, the hedges looming like silent sentinels. The breeze carried the faint scent of damp earth, mixing with the sharp tang of the approaching storm. It felt like time itself had slowed down, stretching the seconds into something thick, almost suffocating. Claire and I moved deeper into the labyrinth. The further we went, the quieter it became, the whispers of the guests fading as if they, too, were caught in the maze's strange grip. I paused at an intersection, the branches overhead casting long, spindly shadows across the stone path. There's something off about this place, I muttered to Claire, still scanning every angle. I can't shake the feeling that it's more than just a backdrop for the crime. Claire's sharp gaze followed mine. The maze was designed to confuse, but it also creates a kind of false sense of security. You're right. Whoever did this, they knew the layout. And they knew exactly where Cranston would be. I nodded, stepping forward again, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots sending small echoes through the silent corridors. This wasn't a random location. Cranston was brought here. He didn't wander in. We reached a fork in the path, one side leading toward a small gazebo in the center of the maze. It was a perfect vantage point, hidden in plain sight. I could feel my pulse quickening, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "This is it," I said, looking at Claire. "We need to search the gazebo. If the killer planned this, they'd want to watch everything unfold. They'd need to stay hidden." As we approached the gazebo, the wooden structure seemed almost too peaceful, too quaint for a crime like this. But in a place where nothing was as it seemed, even something as simple as a garden retreat held secrets. I stepped onto the platform, Claire a few steps behind me, and I immediately noticed something unusual. A slight indentation in the floorboards. It was subtle, but it was there. Something had been moved recently. Carefully, I crouched down and pried up the board, my fingers brushing against cold metal. It was a small, silver key, intricately designed with a family crest that I immediately recognized. It was Cranston's. The key had to belong to a private vault, one that would contain all his secrets, his wealth, his hidden dealings. "Claire," I said, holding up the key, "we need to find out what this opens." Now, her eyes widened. "This changes things. If this key's involved, then it's more than just a personal vendetta. Someone wanted to make a statement." I pocketed the key, my mind racing. Cranston had been many things, a philanthropist, a businessman, a man of influence, but he was also a man with enemies. If someone had planned his death so meticulously, they weren't just after revenge. They wanted to control something, something that went deeper than a mere killing. As we turned to head back, a new sound reached my ears. A soft rustling, barely perceptible, coming from behind a row of thick hedges. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Claire nodded, her hand instinctively going to the gun at her waist. We moved towards the sound cautiously, the darkened paths narrowing with every step. Whoever was hiding here was waiting for us, and I had a feeling they had more to say than just the truth about Edward Cranston's death. The rustling grew louder, the air thick with tension. My hand hovered near my own weapon as we moved closer to the source of the noise. The hedge seemed to press in on us, narrowing the space, as though the maze itself was closing in, tightening its grip. We reached the bend, and there, crouched behind the thick green walls, was a figure, dressed in black, their face obscured by a mask just like the others. The figure's body was stiff with surprise, caught mid-movement, as if they hadn't expected us to find them. I raised a hand to signal Claire to stay back. With my voice low, I called out, "Don't move." The figure froze, then slowly stood, pushing back against the hedge as they did. The mask on their face was a smooth, featureless white, the kind that mirrored no expression, made it impossible to read. But their eyes, those eyes, shifted, betraying the hint of panic. I took a step forward. "You've been hiding, waiting, haven't you? You knew the maze. You knew exactly where to be. And you knew when it was safe to move." They didn't respond. The silence hung between us, as if the maze itself was holding its breath. Claire took a step closer, her eyes never leaving the masked figure. "What's your game? Are you the one who killed Cranston?" The figure's shoulders tensed, but still no words. A gloved hand slowly reached inside their coat. I didn't hesitate. "Step away from whatever you're reaching for. Now." But instead of a weapon, they pulled out a small, leather-bound book. The cover was worn, the edges frayed as though it had been handled frequently over the years. They held it out, almost like a confession, the weight of it speaking volumes. I stepped forward, my hand inching toward the book. "What's this?" Without a word, they dropped it into my hands, then, with a sudden motion, darted into the maze, vanishing into the twisting labyrinth. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the place where they'd been. "Let them go," Claire said, her voice steady. "We have what we need." I nodded, my gaze shifting back to the book. The weight of it in my hands was undeniable. I flipped it open carefully, the yellowed pages crackling slightly. Inside, there were detailed notes, names, and dates, records of financial transactions, backroom deals, bribes, and promises made under the table. Edward Cranston had been involved in more than just charity work. The book detailed his darker dealings, hidden accounts, political favors, money laundering. And there it was at the very back of the book, names. A list of individuals connected to the money, the power, and ultimately the murder. The killer hadn't just been someone with a personal vendetta against Cranston. They were trying to cover something up. Cranston had known too much, and he was going to expose it all. The key from the gazebo, the one Cranston had kept secret, wasn't just a way to access his private vault. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the proof of a massive corruption network. As I scanned the last page, the truth hit me like a hammer. Cranston had been murdered to keep the corruption buried. The killer didn't want the world to see the ugly underbelly of the city, the political game they had all been playing. And now, with the book in my hands, it was my job to bring it all into the light. I looked at Claire. Her eyes met mine, and without saying a word, we both understood. The maze had been a carefully planned escape route, but it wasn't just for the killer. It was for those who had orchestrated this whole thing. They were still out there, hiding behind their masks, waiting for the storm to pass. But they wouldn't get away with it. The game was far from over. The mask had been lifted, and now, it was time to unmask the truth. I stood there for a moment, holding the leather-bound book, my mind racing. The killer might have vanished into the maze, but the real question was, who else was involved? Cranston's murder was only the tip of a much darker iceberg. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about power, about keeping something much bigger hidden, and I was holding the evidence that could tear it all apart. I turned to Claire. We need to get out of here. This, I motioned to the book, is just the beginning. She nodded. We'll bring this back to the station, get it analyzed. But it's bigger than we thought, isn't it? Cranston wasn't just murdered. He was silenced. As we started to make our way back through the maze, the sense of urgency pushed us forward. Every step seemed to echo in the silence, the weight of the case pressing on my chest like a ticking clock. Whoever was behind this wasn't just going to sit idly by. They were watching. They were waiting. We reached the entrance of the maze, the guests still clustered near the periphery, murmuring among themselves. The atmosphere had shifted. The initial shock was gone, replaced with a quiet tension, like a game of musical chairs where everyone was secretly hoping not to be the one left standing when the music stopped. I scanned the crowd. They were all still wearing their masks, hiding their faces, hiding their true intentions. But there was one figure who caught my eye, a tall man with a sharply cut jaw, a gleaming mask in the shape of a hawk, and a look in his eyes that suggested he knew exactly what was happening. Edward Cranston's closest business associate, Robert Shaw. I'd seen him in photos with Cranston, standing side by side at charity events, their arms around each other like old friends. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Shaw wasn't just a friend. He was someone who would do anything to protect the network Cranston had been about to expose. I motioned for Claire to follow me. We made our way through the guests, moving toward Shaw, who seemed to notice us the moment we approached. "Detective," he greeted smoothly, his voice like honey, too calm for the situation. "A tragic night, isn't it?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Where were you when Cranston was killed?" His gaze flickered slightly, but his smile remained intact. "I was enjoying the party, of course. Like everyone else." "Funny, I didn't see you near the body," Claire interjected, her voice sharp. "You were a little too well hidden, weren't you?" Shaw's expression didn't falter, but there was a slight tightening in his jaw. "I've been here the entire time. If you want to talk to someone about alibis, you should speak to the others. I'm sure you'll find plenty of people who saw me." I stepped closer, the distance between us narrowing. "You knew about the key, didn't you? The vault. The book Cranston was keeping hidden." His eyes darkened, just for a moment, before the mask slipped back into place. "You're grasping at straws, detective. Cranston was a complicated man with complicated business. This doesn't have anything to do with me." I didn't buy it. I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of something more, something dangerous. He was hiding something, and I knew that he knew I was getting closer to the truth. I pulled the book from my coat and held it out in front of him. "This came from the maze. It's in Cranston's handwriting. You want to tell me what's inside?" His face went pale, his fingers twitching as if he might reach for it, but he stopped himself. The hawk mask on his face seemed to mock him now, his calm exterior cracking. "You don't understand. It's not that simple." Before I could press him further, Claire's voice cut through. "Detective, look." I turned to see her staring across the garden, her hand raised to point. Through the thinning crowd, a sleek black car had pulled up at the gates. A tall woman in a red gown stepped out, her mask an elegant design of black lace and gold filigree, the kind of woman who didn't belong in this maze of masks and deceit. "Who's that?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "That's Isabel Grant," Claire said, voice tense. "She's one of the biggest donors in Cranston's charity. But she doesn't just donate. She's got connections everywhere, politics, finance, the kind of connections that could have made her untouchable." I didn't need to hear more. It was clear that Isabel was connected to the dark side of this web, just like Shaw, just like Cranston. But what was her role in all of this? The crowd parted as Isabel made her way toward us, her red dress flowing like a whisper through the air. She approached with a calmness that was almost too poised for the situation. "Detective Claire," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I assume you're still trying to make sense of all this chaos?" "You could say that," I replied. "But it seems you've been busy with more than just the party. You and Cranston had a lot of dealings together. Care to explain?" She smiled, but it was empty. "You have no idea how messy things can get when people think they can control everything. Edward wasn't as innocent as he appeared. He was a man who knew how to manipulate the right people like Robert, like me. But he also made the mistake of thinking he could change things, expose things. And now he's dead," Claire said, her tone biting. "You didn't want that to happen, did you?" Isabel's smile faltered, just for a second, before it returned colder. "The world isn't kind to people who know too much, Detective. And some of us are willing to do whatever it takes to keep things the way they are." It was then that I understood. Cranston had been the pawn, the piece in a much larger game. He had known too much about corruption, about money laundering, and perhaps most dangerously, about the people who were protecting their power at any cost. The book in my hand wasn't just a ledger. It was the nail in the coffin for a dangerous group of people. People who were willing to kill to keep their secrets safe. "We're done here," I said, looking at Shaw and Isabel. "The truth is coming out, whether you like it or not." With that, I turned to Claire, the weight of the book still heavy in my hands, and we walked out of the maze, the storm finally breaking overhead as if the world itself was ready for the truth to be revealed. The killer might have thought they'd escaped, but in the end, no one could hide forever, not in the maze and not from me.